HAF X, ladies and gentlemen. It feels like an era of computing lived and died with this case. The HAF X represented multiple different facets of computer building that have changed a lot in the last year. For example, it's got large fans. Not many cases do anymore. 230 millimeters in the front, 200 millimeters on the side, 200 millimeters on the top, partially also representing why these 200 plus millimeter fans were so difficult to mix and match with cases, because they were not standardized. And the case also had all of the plastic embellishments that you rarely see anymore. Now the style is basically steel panels and glass, and any plastic is shunned. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the View 71 enclosure. The View 71 is a full tower case that's capable of fitting 3 video cards in most configurations. It's also one of the better cooling cases in our recent case testing bench lineup. The View 71 has hinged tempered glass doors on either side that make it easy to open and show off, and it comes with at least one rain fan, though you can get the RGB version if you prefer. Learn more at the link in the description below. So this is something that we don't see too commonly anymore, but the HAF X was once the king of cases, and it deserved the title. It was high airflow, legitimately. It was an expensive case that came with a lot of accessories. It had USB 3 support in 2010, although you did have to route a cable through the case, out the water cooling hole in the back, and into the motherboard. But it had these things, and this was a true flagship case, one that I personally bought and used for several years, and I purchased it about 8 years ago. It's been in storage for at least the last 5, but today we're revisiting the Cooler Master HAF X. Recapping this case quickly then, it came with a lot of accessories. As stated, this is a case that came from an era where plastic was not something to be ashamed of. Having a computer that resembled a 1980s cartoon robot was something that got you sales. And at $200, this needed sales, and it got them. It was one of the better selling cases of its time. It was a well-known flagship case, and part of that was because of its size. You could fit anything in here for the most part. It has lots of hard drive cages. It has lots of 5 1/4 bays. It's got large fans that, whether or not you know anything about cases and airflow, and certainly I knew less then than now, you look at those fans and you think, that's a case that can breathe. So this had enough to turn heads and really get interest in the case industry, and that's why even now you see so much hype around successors, cases that advertise high airflow. The H500P, for example, which had marketing materials that stated guaranteed high volume airflow. This is the origin of that. It's the genesis of that case and everything that's coming after it. So the HAF X certainly was not without flaw, but it was regarded so highly that we thought, what if we look back at it today? What if we review this case like it launched in 2018? Is it as good now as we thought it was then? And more importantly, was it actually good then? Have our opinions been influenced by knowing more about how thermals work and noise works and all of that? So a few features. This case comes with a lot of plastic accessories. One of those is an air duct. You can attach one of 2 different air ducts. We opted to use the one on the side panel fan, 200 millimeter intake fan that is just inches away from the GPU, and therefore will probably have insurmountable cooling performance for the GPU, as we'll discuss in the thermal section. So it's got a cowl on the fan here. We rotated it so that it can hit the GPU, clear the cooler, and get some air on the CPU. Alternatively, you could have placed a similar air duct up front to direct air in from the front fan straight onto the GPU and out of the hard drive cages. It also came with an internal SATA interface that would allow you to somewhat hot swap drives out of the front of the chassis, and you plug them in, they mount and pressure fit against SATA interfaces that are then using a pass-through to go to the motherboard. This was another accessory feature that felt high-end. Fan hubs weren't really a thing yet, so there were no fan hubs in here. Power supply shrouds weren't even a thing yet either. So power supply shrouds are an interesting one. These were popularized around 2013 or 2014 by NZXT with the S340, the original. That's the case that is, it's I believe, NZXT's best-selling ever case in North America. And the power supply shroud was popularized then. This case came out years before it, but it still had something of a power supply shroud. It had a plastic shroud that was removable. It fitted in the front, strictly over the cables. It did not cover the whole power supply, and that was the way they did it. There was no good resolution to the problem of ugly cables. Now we just cover the entire bottom chamber. But back then, that was how you did it, and considering that modular power supplies weren't even all that common at the time, there was more of a price premium than today, it made a lot of sense to go that route. This case also has a couple of features that are sadly pretty high-end even today. And one of those is hinged doors. Internally, the case has a couple of flaws by today's standards. One of those is the lack of any kind of dust filtration on the bottom of the case. Because of the stock configuration, what you have is positive pressure at the front. So you're taking air in through the front, you have exhaust up top, you have exhaust in the back. What ends up happening, as we've demonstrated through testing, is that you get a lot of air drafting in through the bottom. And because we have this on caster wheels, which, by the way, another really cool feature, we have it on caster wheels, so it's raised up, and that means that air does, in fact, come in through the bottom. We have no dust filter on the bottom, and I'm pretty sure it did not come with one either. So that is where a lot of your dust comes in through the case. And because it's got this crenellation on the top of the case, you end up with dust trapped in all of the small corners, which some of it is still there, even though we did actually try to clean it off. So it's definitely a dust-friendly case, and not in a good way. But to be fair, that wasn't really as much of a concern as it is today. We had other features then to drive case sales than dust filtration, steel, glass, and LEDs. The focus was on other things. So an example of limited dust filtration. How does this one come off? The front panel is a great example of the poorly designed, although for then it was somewhat permissible, dust filtration. To get the dust filter out of this detachable panel, you had to bend these backwards, and then you could separate the two pieces of mesh. And one of the problems with dust filtration on this case was that its dust filters basically were really fine mesh between an outside metal grill, to which dust would stick, but a lot of it got through, and an inside honeycomb pattern. So there's a really fine mesh in between here, something that Cooler Master has revived for their upcoming H500P mesh, which uses the original H500P front panel, actually heavily modified, to have mesh and then a backing finer dust filter. So it's that approach, except much harder to clean on the old HAF X, but also less of a concern for the time. Other things here, visually, it's interesting. It's one of those things, it appeals to a certain type of person. There's kind of a nuclear smokestack effect on the top with the two 200mm options, and because the fan takes up the entire bay, there's not really much wasted space there. This top power button front I/O thing has an unnecessary sliding cover that doesn't really do much for you. The side panel, for example, has a window that really is sort of almost comical in how useless it is. But this is before the tempered glass revolution, and what else are you going to do? There's a 200mm fan here. Not a lot you can do. There's kind of a weak LED in the front of the case, barely provides enough light to see anything through the window. So it just shows kind of how the times have changed, especially with visuals and aesthetics. But of course, they've somewhat regressed with cooling performance. So radiator support and liquid cooling support in general were more or less non-existent, but also wasn't really as much of a thing at this time. Liquid coolers mostly sucked or were really expensive. Cable management is another area where it succeeds through brute force. The left side panel of the case bows out a bit, and that's enough to jam most of the cables into. It has some cable tie points, but not a whole lot of them, and it's certainly lacking in that department, another sign of the times. Now, it's not necessarily true that the top dog case is the one with the most junk crammed into it. This was once the theme, and the HAF X was a flagship case that we bought, but the industry has seriously changed. Even when we built in this 8 years ago, we removed the drive cage duct, the video card support, and the power supply shroud, although there is photographic evidence of cold cathode tubes and underglow for the case, so we were a bit ahead of the times on RGB. Cable tie points aren't tidally placed in pairs like cases we've reviewed lately, but they exist, which was good enough at the time. There's plenty of room to spread out cables and tie them down, especially with the bulky stock USB and SATA cables cleared out of the way. Getting into thermals, HAF stands for high airflow, and the HAF X certainly is that. This is where it differs from the H500P. The H500P technically doesn't have HAF, HAF, in the name. So it's not necessarily directly a successor to this product, but it had marketing materials that said guaranteed high volume airflow, something else about high airflow in the reviewer's guide, and it has two 200 millimeter very visible fans in the front. So this was a case that, even though it wasn't perfectly in name, it was meant to follow the HAF X. We never used the video card cowl, but we did use the side panel one, rotated 90 degrees so that it would clear our modern GPU. The manual does say that only one or the other should be used anyway, and we prefer the less bulky one. The CPU averaged 50.9 degrees Celsius over ambient in the torture test, with no shroud on the side panel. Temperature averaged 49.1 degrees Celsius, a difference within margin of error, but one which could also be due to the more distributed airflow pattern. Switching to double 200mm top intake had a more dramatic effect, and temperature lowered to 45.9 degrees. Our CPU cooler is oriented to move air away from the front of the case to the back, so the top intake fans didn't point directly into it, but they still provided much more air than is otherwise sent to the top of the case. Removing the front panel had no significant effect on the CPU temperature, since the only intake fan that benefits from removing the panel isn't pointed towards the CPU. There's a large distance between the front panel and the CPU cooler. It's partially obstructed by an optical drive bay, and the front panel is so well ventilated anyway that it wouldn't make much of a difference. Comparatively, 50.9 degrees over ambient isn't as good as the Redline 06 at 47.8 or the Cougar Conquer at 48.5, but it's still among the very best results for a stock case on our chart. Given how little emphasis the stock configuration puts on CPU cooling, that's impressive. With an additional fan and the top intake configuration blowing more air through the top of the case, the HAF X's 45.9 degree result is only beaten by the Silverstone Raven 02, which is from a similar era, and lines 3 180mm air penetrator fans up with the CPU cooler. The stock H500P was nowhere close, falling behind at 56.1 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, which further illustrates one of our primary concerns with the initial marketing materials that referenced high air volume. Removing the front panel of the H500P allowed an average 43.7 degree Celsius temperature, which is impressive, and it shows the cooling potential of two unrestricted 200mm fans, but it's not that much better than the top intake configuration of the proper once Canon HAF X. We're moving on to GPU torture thermals next. 46.9 degrees over ambient was the average GPU temperature during the same test. Removing the side panel shroud raised this to 50.6 degrees as the airflow was less concentrated, and removing the front panel again caused practically no change from baseline. The top intake test was slightly warmer than baseline at 47.5, but within margin of error. The upper section of the case is separated from the bottom by the GPU backplate, and the top intake and rear exhaust air cycle doesn't interact much with the heatsink side of the GPU. In the stock configuration, some incoming air must pass by the GPU to get to the top rear of the case. Thanks to the side intake fan, the stock result for the HAF X is the coolest GPU temperature on our chart, although within margin of error and somewhat tying the Redline 06. It does technically chart top though, and for that, the HAF X holds strong onto its long-held airflow badge. This was a properly high airflow setup, and it's largely enabled by the now rare side panel fan. Even with the top intake arrangement intended to benefit the CPU was cooler in the HAF X than in any other case besides the Redline 06. The stock H500P averaged 54.9 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, a difference of 8 degrees. This is why we were so disappointed in the H500P's middling performance. Even without the front panel, GPU temperature in the H500P averaged higher than the HAF X by a couple degrees, and that's because of the advantage of side intake, something that very few cases have these days, so that's not just the new H500P. Moving on to 3D Mark, 46.9 degrees is easily the lowest average GPU temperature we've seen in the Firestrike Extreme stress test. Next bests are the Silverstone Raven 02 and PM01 cases, neither of which have side intake fans. And remember, the This is a test period of 30 minutes, so it has plenty of time to reach steady state. The stock H500P averaged 58.9 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient on the opposite side of the chart, and a full 12 degrees warmer in its results. Silverstone proves that a side panel intake isn't necessarily required to perform well in this test, but the HAF X shows the incredible efficiency of a large side panel fan positioned inches away from the GPU shroud. The case was in stock configuration for 3D Mark and Blender tests, so CPU cooling in Blender wasn't as good as it could be with the top intake result we tested previously. Rendering on the CPU, core temperature averaged 36.6 degrees Celsius, which is exactly the same, or almost, as the PM01 and Cougar Conquer, and a bit warmer than the Raven 02 and Redline 06. It's still among the top performers though, just as it was in the torture test. Knowing that reconfiguring the top improves this further shows the versatility of this well-cooled case, or optional well-cooled case. Rendering on the GPU temperature is again the lowest we've seen at 23.2 degrees versus the PM01's 23.7 delta T over ambient. This is within margin of error, but impressive nonetheless. The H500P averaged 28.8 degrees Celsius GPU delta T, a difference of 5.6 degrees in a test where most cases fall within a total range of 10 degrees. Noise isn't nearly as bad as it could be on a case with 4 fans and holes everywhere. The 44.6 decibel Raven 02 proves that. 41.1 dBA is definitely loud, but the major advantage of using only a single fan smaller than 200 millimeters is that none of them individually produce much noise. The side cowl helps by concentrating air from a large and therefore quiet fan into a small area, rather than just using a 120mm fan. If the additional fan mounts on the video card support and drive cage were filled, noise levels would increase significantly. And the point here isn't to dredge up bad memories of the H500P, but just to show how things have changed, and if this case ever really was as good as we all thought it was, at least as I thought it was at the time that I bought it for $200. So the HAF X, it wasn't the end point of case design, and 2010's requirements were certainly different than now. Innovations have actually occurred in case manufacturing. Wouldn't seem really all that possible to change cases very much, but they've changed a lot, clearly. So this isn't really a discussion of whether you should buy it now, because you shouldn't. You should not go buy the HAF X for $200, which you can do, new, and with even better USB 3 support than this one, the original, has, but you shouldn't buy it because it's just changed too much. The case has great cooling configurations compared to modern cases, but there are other modern cases that offer that too. Not as many, mind you, but they do it, and they also offer other modern amenities, like a better power supply shroud if you want that, LEDs in better positions if you want that, better cable management, better ease of installation features. The HAF X has support for a Gigabyte XL ATX form factor motherboard. When's the last time you heard of one of those? It was probably 2010 or thereabouts. So this is a case where it's hard to clean, even externally. The drive cages can't be removed. The fans aren't all that great. It's so big that it needs wheels. The case now doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, oh, and by the way, basically no liquid cooling support in a $200 case, but this is a 2010 product. So looking back at it now, if the question is, was it really as good as we thought it was? I'd have to say the answer is yes. This was a reasonably well-designed case by Cooler Master. Its major faults are things like dust management, which is almost always a side effect of something that has legitimately decent airflow. Now, companies have advanced airflow design since then. They've certainly degraded it as well, depending on which one you're looking at. But for advancements, you see things now like none of this. None of these holes all through the front panel where they don't need to exist, where there's no fan, where it's impossible to clean the dust filters. No. Now we have better dust filters. We have mesh grills for the front that certainly existed here, but they just weren't that cleanable or maintainable. So it's certainly improved, but we do think that this case genuinely was one of the better options for the era. The excessive 3.5 and 5.25 bays and the overall appearance of the case are dated, but they made sense at the time. As stated earlier, the 1980s cartoon robot look was in, as was at one point, just prior to this, acrylic. I believe Linus has a video coming up showing how he purchase ordered a bunch of acrylic things for radiators at the time. So it was clearly part of the in crowd, although I think he apologizes for never having sold any. But that's beside the point. The point is that this case, even now, thermally and to some extent acoustically, is a pretty decent performer. It's a chart topper. It's the best in several GPU categories. So that's the power of side panel cooling. Someone recently asked us what we thought of side panel cooling. There's your answer. If you want the coolest possible GPU temperatures, especially for multi-card configurations for like a render or workstation box, side panel intake will get it for you with the least effort, the lowest fan speeds, and therefore the least noise. You could configure the rest of these fans to be lower RPM and let the side panel fan blast, and you'd be perfectly fine for thermals, and your noise levels would be even lower than we measured. So it's got decent design elements, and although we wouldn't recommend it today, it was a good purchase at the time, depending, of course, on your style for the externals. But we do hope that the H500P mesh coming up soon will be a proper successor to this, hence the revisit. And given our panelist testing and previous Meshify testing of the H500P, we think it's possible that it could be a good thermal performer. Cooler Master's done a lot to address all of our concerns with the upcoming H500P and even the H500M. And when I say H500P, I do mean the mesh version. So they've addressed most of our concerns as we showed in our CES coverage, and we'll soon be covering that case in a full review. We are purchasing the case ourselves. We're getting it through side channels, so it'll be 1 to 2 days later than everyone else, but I can assure you it'd be worth the watch. So make sure you subscribe so you can catch that. And as always, go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you want to support this type of content. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our mod mats. We are restocking them very soon, and you'll want to be in that first wave because we sold out pretty quickly last time. So thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.